When both you and the narcissist become silent, the world does not suddenly feel calm. Instead, it can seem as if something has shattered beneath the surface where no one else can see it. In that moment, someone slowly begins to lose control, and surprisingly, it is not you. Many people believe that when two people stop talking, the story is over. They assume both sides have accepted what happened and quietly moved on with their lives. But reality is often much more disturbing than that. This is usually the stage where the narcissist enters a deep psychological spiral while your own recovery finally starts taking shape. Stay with me, because what comes next is the part almost no one talks about, yet it explains so much. If any of this already feels strangely familiar, keep watching. Understanding what is happening beneath the surface can completely change how you see the silence. Once you recognize the hidden psychological patterns, it becomes much easier to stop repeating them. That awareness is often the first real step toward lasting freedom. What appears to be nothing happening is actually a period where everything begins to shift. The silence may look empty from the outside, but underneath it, powerful emotional changes are unfolding. This is where the balance quietly starts to change. Keep listening, because one small detail later will connect everything you have experienced in a way that finally makes sense. When both you and the narcissist stop reaching out, the first process that usually begins on their side is something like a mental reset. It happens quietly, it happens inside their mind. Most people never notice it because it develops in complete silence long before they decide whether to contact you again. When you choose silence, you often experience it as creating distance for your own well-being. You see it as protecting yourself. You see it as taking back your emotional space. Sometimes you even recognize it as the beginning of genuine healing. They usually see the same silence in a completely different way. To them, your silence becomes information that must be studied. It becomes a message they feel forced to decode instead of a boundary they should respect. Their attention is not focused on the pain they caused you. Instead, they focus on one question: how did they lose their control? Emotionally healthy people often reflect on their own actions and wonder if they hurt someone. A narcissist rarely begins there. Instead, they start examining every possible explanation. Did your attention move somewhere else? Are you trying to make them suffer? Has another person taken their place? Are you trying to test them? Their mind searches for hidden motives, secret meanings, and possible threats. Uncertainty creates deep discomfort for them, so your silence becomes a mystery they feel driven to solve. Keep watching, because the next phase is where the emotional pressure begins to grow even stronger. You may wrestle with guilt long after the silence begins. You may even mourn the version of yourself that accepted far more than anyone should ever have to accept. Your silence is usually not created out of anger. It comes from emotional exhaustion. You reach a place where your mind, your heart, and even your body can no longer carry the constant confusion. You are searching for breathing room. You are trying to recover your self-respect. You are trying to find clear thinking again after living inside emotional chaos for so long. That inner battle is not small. It follows you into the night and steals your sleep. It shakes your confidence. It changes how you remember the past. It even makes you question who you really are. Every quiet moment can feel heavy because your emotions are finally catching up with everything you pushed aside just to survive. Yet even in that discomfort, something important is happening. You are slowly reconnecting with yourself instead of constantly managing someone else's emotions. That process is difficult, but it is also where real healing begins. Stay with me, because the next part explains why your silence has such a powerful effect, even when you feel like nothing is happening. What seems invisible on the outside is creating a major shift underneath the surface, and that shift changes the entire emotional balance. While you are carrying the weight of recovery, the narcissist often sees the silence through a completely different perspective. They rarely sit quietly with the loss the way you do. They usually do not spend much time asking themselves what they did wrong or how deeply they wounded you. honest self-examination is often replaced with something much more practical. Their first reaction is commonly based on disruption rather than heartbreak. Your silence interrupts the routine they had become comfortable with. They had grown used to reaching you whenever they wanted. They expected your attention, your emotional reactions, your explanations, your apologies, your care, and sometimes even your frustration. Every response reminded them that they still had influence. Then suddenly, it all stops. The steady flow of emotional validation disappears without warning. That absence does not always leave them emotionally devastated. More often, it leaves them irritated. It feels like losing access to something they had started treating as guaranteed. It becomes frustrating, it becomes inconvenient. Instead of focusing on the relationship itself, they often focus on why the familiar pattern has suddenly changed. Their attention stays fixed on restoring access instead of understanding your pain. Keep watching because the next insight reveals why this difference matters far more than most people realize. As the silence continues, the contrast between both experiences becomes impossible to overlook. You are grieving the relationship that you hoped could exist. They are measuring the loss of influence they once enjoyed. You are trying to rebuild your confidence piece by piece. They are trying to understand why their usual methods no longer produce the same result. You feel the emptiness left behind by broken trust. They feel the interruption of losing predictable emotional responses. Little by little, you begin seeing how much of yourself you sacrificed just to keep the peace. You recognize the times you stayed quiet to avoid conflict, apologized for things that were never your fault, and ignored your own needs simply to prevent another emotional storm. At the same time, they begin noticing that the old strategies are no longer working. The emotional imbalance that once benefited them starts to disappear. Your silence leads you inward toward reflection, strength, and recovery. Their silence often leads toward frustration, entitlement, and growing discomfort. As both of you remain quiet, they rarely experience that silence as healthy distance or mutual space. Instead, they often see it as a challenge to their sense of control. To them, someone they once influenced choosing silence can feel like an act of defiance. This is because they often view relationships through the desire for control instead of mutual respect. And that difference explains why the same silence creates two completely different emotional realities. The next part brings everything together, so do not miss it. When you stop replying, stop reaching out, and stop giving them your attention, something important begins to shift inside their psychological world. The balance they believed existed is suddenly interrupted. They often see your silence as an act of resistance, even when your only goal is to protect your peace, regain your emotional stability, or finally clear your mind. In their thinking, silence is almost never viewed as neutral. It quickly becomes opposition. It becomes disrespect. It becomes proof that the influence they once believed they had over you may be slipping away. This is exactly why silence can affect them more deeply than any argument ever could. An argument still keeps them connected to you. Strong emotions still remind them they matter in your emotional world. Even your anger can reassure them that they still have a place in your thoughts. Silence changes all of that. It quietly removes them from the center of your attention. That change threatens the story they have been telling themselves for a very long time. For what may be the first time, your silence forces them to face a possibility they have spent years avoiding. Maybe they are not as essential, as admired, or as powerful as they convinced themselves they were. Stay with me because this next insight explains why that realization becomes so deeply unsettling for them. People with these patterns rarely build their confidence from a secure place inside themselves. Instead, their sense of worth is often held together by what they receive from others. Attention keeps it alive. Emotional reactions strengthen it. Praise, admiration, and constant validation become the support holding everything together. You became part of that system without fully realizing it. Your feelings mattered because they confirmed their importance. Your replies mattered because they proved they could still reach you. Even the times you returned after conflict reinforced the belief that they remained in control. Every apology you offered, every explanation you gave, and every effort you made to repair the connection quietly strengthened their confidence in their own influence. Then your silence interrupts that entire pattern. Suddenly, the familiar cycle disappears. That interruption creates a moment they cannot easily escape. It exposes something they would rather never admit, even privately. It reveals how much they had come to rely on your continued engagement. The image they built of themselves depended on believing they controlled the relationship, decided the distance between you, and determined when closeness or separation would happen. Your silence challenges every part of that belief. It suggests that you have stepped outside the role they expected you to play. That possibility shakes the carefully protected identity they spent so much energy maintaining. Keep watching, because the final piece reveals why they often become increasingly restless even while remaining completely silent. Without your reactions, they have nothing left to push against. There is no emotional energy to redirect, no conflict to manage, and no predictable response they can point to as proof that they still hold influence. That absence becomes deeply uncomfortable. Not because they are grieving the relationship with genuine emotional maturity, but because the structure of control they depended on begins to weaken. This is often when their thoughts become increasingly unsettled. They replay old conversations over and over, searching for the exact moment everything changed. They look for clues they believe they overlooked. They question whether someone else has entered your life or whether something has shifted beyond their reach. They quietly watch for any opportunity to regain the position they once believed was secure. Even if they never contact you, the silence grows louder inside their own mind than they expected. The difference now is that they no longer know what is happening in your life. They cannot read your thoughts. They cannot predict your next decision. They cannot assume you will respond the way you always did before. That uncertainty removes the illusion that they fully understand or control your behavior. As more time passes, that uncertainty often becomes far more unsettling than any argument ever could, because silence leaves them with questions they cannot answer. And for someone who depends on certainty and control, unanswered questions can become the loudest voice of all. Suddenly, they are no longer standing at the center of your emotional world, and that loss of importance becomes extremely difficult for them to accept. Their mindset slowly begins to change. Confidence turns into worry. Entitlement changes into suspicion. The certainty they once displayed starts giving way to confusion and instability. All of this can begin because of something as simple as your absence. From the outside, it may seem as though nothing is happening while both of you remain silent. But beneath the surface, they are often moving through a series of predictable psychological reactions designed to recover the sense of control they believe they have lost. Their mind starts searching for ways to restore the old dynamic. They begin looking for familiar patterns that once guaranteed your attention. The silence that brings you peace becomes something they struggle to tolerate because it leaves them without the emotional certainty they once depended on. Stay with me, because the next part reveals the methods they often use when they feel their influence slipping away, and understanding them can help you avoid getting pulled back into the same cycle again. One of the first responses is often an attempt to fill the emptiness your absence has created through behaviors that are meant to draw you back in. These actions are rarely random. They usually serve as psychological strategies for regaining influence when they sense they are losing their grip. At first, they may believe your silence is only temporary. They assume you will eventually come back because that has happened before. They have learned to expect it. But when the silence continues, anxiety can begin to replace that confidence. This is often when they try to reconnect. They may send a kind message that seems completely harmless. They may remind you of a happy memory from the past. They may suddenly describe a personal problem or an emergency that appears to need your help. At times, they may even sound deeply sorry, unusually thoughtful, or surprisingly self-aware. Their behavior changes depending on what they believe is most likely to succeed. The purpose is not always sincere healing or honest reconciliation. More often, the real objective is to restore the connection that allowed them to feel in control. If one approach does not work, they frequently adjust and try another. Keep watching, because the next strategy is even more subtle, and many people mistake it for coincidence when it is anything but. If gentle attempts fail, or if reaching out directly feels too risky for them, they may begin trying to provoke an emotional reaction instead. The specific emotion is usually less important than the fact that you respond. They may post something online that they know could make you jealous or curious. They may send a cold, distant, or dismissive message hoping it will upset you enough to reply. Sometimes they create unnecessary drama simply to pull your attention back toward them. Any emotional response gives them a feeling that they are still important in your life. Silence removes that feeling, so provoking a reaction becomes another way of reopening the emotional connection. If even that fails, they may involve another person. They could suddenly highlight a new relationship, mention an old partner, involve a friend, or draw family members into the situation. The goal is rarely about building healthy relationships with those people. Instead, it is often about creating insecurity, making you question your value, or encouraging you to compete for a place you already chose to leave behind. These behaviors should not be mistaken for genuine love or deep emotional growth. They usually reflect a strong dependence on outside validation to maintain their sense of identity. When that validation disappears, they often rush to rebuild it using whatever method seems most likely to work. That is why understanding these patterns matters. Once you recognize them for what they truly are, they lose much of the power they once had over you. These behaviors are not real attempts to build emotional closeness or create a healthier relationship. More often, they are driven by fear, entitlement, and the shock of losing the control they once believed they had. Your silence becomes the trigger. As the quiet continues, something much deeper begins to happen. Most people never expect this stage because it develops so slowly that it is almost invisible. You may experience the silence as the beginning of peace. You may feel that it is leading you toward acceptance and emotional closure. They often experience that exact same silence in a completely different way. Instead of feeling calm, they begin feeling increasingly uneasy. Your silence does not comfort them. It reminds them that they are no longer directing the emotional connection the way they once did. Because so much of their identity depends on how other people respond to them, especially someone they once influenced, your lack of response creates an internal sense of alarm. This is the difference that changes everything. The quiet that gives you relief often creates discomfort for them. What feels like freedom to you can feel like panic to someone whose confidence depends on constant attention. Stay with me, because the next part explains why this silence becomes more powerful with every passing day. Many people with these patterns depend on emotional stimulation from others to keep their self-image alive. They search for attention, admiration, conflict, excitement, or even drama. Anything that keeps them at the center of another person's emotional world. When that source suddenly disappears, they often struggle to steady themselves. Your silence removes the feedback they had quietly come to depend on, and that absence starts a psychological chain reaction. At first, they may pretend it does not matter. They may act completely unaffected. They might even appear relieved or indifferent. But in many cases, that attitude is only a protective mask covering growing discomfort. As more time passes, ignoring the silence becomes harder. Without your attention reinforcing the image they have of themselves, they can begin feeling overlooked, unimportant, or forgotten. Those feelings are especially painful because they touch one of their deepest fears, the fear of becoming ordinary, invisible, or emotionally insignificant. At the same time, something entirely different is happening inside you. While they struggle with uncertainty, your nervous system slowly begins settling down. The constant emotional tension starts fading. The mental fog begins to clear. Little by little, you remember your own value instead of measuring yourself through someone else's approval. You begin reconnecting with the parts of yourself that had been pushed aside for far too long. Keep watching because the next realization ties everything together in a way most people never see. As the silence grows longer, the difference between both experiences becomes impossible to ignore. They may replay old conversations again and again, searching for hidden meanings or trying to understand why you no longer respond the way you once did. They imagine different explanations. They create stories that help them make sense of the uncertainty. The unanswered questions slowly become more difficult for them to carry. Often, what they miss most is not the relationship itself, but the reflection of themselves they once saw through your emotional reactions. Meanwhile, your silence continues working in the opposite direction. It becomes a place where healing quietly takes root. You begin feeling pieces of yourself returning. They begin feeling the carefully protected image they built starting to weaken. What brings you peace creates discomfort for them. What helps you recover leaves them without the emotional certainty they once relied upon. This contrast exposes the imbalance that existed from the very beginning. The silence that once felt frightening slowly becomes the space where you reclaim your confidence, your clarity, and your sense of identity. As more time passes, something else begins changing inside you. It may happen gradually, almost without you noticing, but it is deeply important. Your nervous system, after spending so long expecting criticism, conflict, or emotional unpredictability, finally has a chance to relax. Living in these unhealthy relationship patterns often trains you to stay constantly alert. You learn to predict moods before they appear. You carefully watch every reaction. You measure every word, always preparing for the next emotional storm. Now, for the first time in a long while, your mind starts realizing that it no longer has to live that way. And that quiet realization becomes one of the strongest signs that true healing has already begun.